Hello everybody and welcome. Grab your coffee. Today we're going to have a coffee talk episode 6 and today's theme is going to be about my preference on retro, arcade and current Nintendo games over pretty much everything else that comes outside that isn't a fighting game or a JRPG. So before I go on immediately, I wanted to thank everyone that subscribed to the channel recently. It has been very beautiful to see the support from every one of you. And if you haven't yet and you're watching, you're one of the 95% that haven't, please consider doing so because I want to grow this channel. My goal is at least to reach 1000 subs. I don't expect anything too crazy, but just at least, growing to be able to see more people enjoying the content. So, without further ado, we will dive into the video that I have prepared. It's a little bit of the start of Golden Sun, and I wanted to change a little bit the way that I do the videos because I think that maybe it's too boring to just see my face. So yeah, I wanted to do this, at least give a little bit of visual stimulation of something else while I'm talking. So the reason that I prefer retro, arcade and the current Nintendo games over pretty much everything else is first because they tend to not get too involved with reality and specifically political messaging of current events. I don't really mind having their own politics, something like Triangle Strategy or something like Metal Gear Solid. That is completely fine, but in my opinion and my taste, something like what we see these days with how much we have all these identity politics and stuff like that, I'm not really a fan of that. That is not something that I ever thought that gaming will ever come to be. But now it is. So I don't really have any say outside of not buying these kind of games. And yeah, that is one of the reasons that I prefer to stick to older games and Nintendo current games and some other newer games that come out these days that don't really indulge into that kind of thing. Another thing that I want to say is that older games and Nintendo games really tend to have a specific combination of visual and audio stimulation that doesn't really take agency of the imagination of the player. And pretty much what I mean by that is that when you're hearing some voice of a character, you may think that it's not what you expected. A lot of the franchises of Nintendo games and in general older games didn't really have any audio. So when you're going now to everyone having a specific voice, that may be something that you don't really imagine that it will be like that, or something like character wouldn't sound like that. So there is a lot of situations that people prefer to have less stimulation on specific things like visuals, to have more of an idea of what something looks like when you're looking on a book illustration about a character, but not really trying to make it too realistic, not trying to make it like this is exactly how it looks, sounds and does. So you will have some, obviously, some agency over your imagination around what something looks like, what something sounds like, and what something feels like in general. So all these things that could be something that to some people they could reminisce back in the older days. It's like the difference between reading a manga or a book to watching an anime or a movie adaptation of the original work. All the times having less information and using our imagination, most likely it's going to be superior because our imagination is mostly catered to ourselves. We're always going to imagine what we want. And many times if someone tries to present you their version, most likely it's not going to be above your expectations. So there is a reason why a lot of people and critics are always harsh about adaptations of other media from one media type to another. And you see this a lot even from video games, from something like The Witcher to becoming a TV show and taking too much liberties and then people getting mad. Another thing that kind of have been lost in time is the mastery of your controller. These days, that doesn't really exist. If you remember back in the day, you would have games that you will have to have specifically tapping the controller while holding another button to do a specific technique that you learn about this game in order to do something like an advanced mechanic. These days people think some games like Dark Souls are really hard, but in reality, compared to back in the day that you have to master specific things on your controllers or like how to do specific movements in order to be able to consistently do something like a parry these days is funny to say to someone that is something really hard. Sure, you could have to get the timing right, but eventually you will get it right. So back in the day, like especially like arcade games, they will get to be really brutal. So like even the slightest thing, you will get punished immediately. And that is something that Dark Souls games don't really do. All the other games don't really punish you for not being observant. And that is why these days the difficulty also has been watered down a lot compared to back in the day. And I'm not saying that I was a super hardcore player, but definitely if you're playing something like an action game and you compare it, the action games that we have now with the action games that we have back then, it is quite the big difference with how much harder it was back then or how many advanced techniques you could have or what the developer will expect out of you to understand and play. Now these days, from one point, it is better than ever because everyone can play them. But I think that you could really just play anything as long as you put your mind into it. I mean, back in the day when we were playing Mega Man and stuff like that, that was brutal. That was not easy. But these days, no one really talks about these games, about how like difficult and stuff like that they were. And yeah, like the advanced kind of mechanics to use your controller outside of new arcade games, they kind of gone. You don't really have that anymore. Usually it's about pressing buttons, smashing one specific thing, and not really anything else. And especially even on RPGs, the curve has been going down for a while to making everything more convenient and easier, so everyone can enjoy these games. Now that for me that is something that after you experience like harder games, it's not as exciting when you go to experience easier games of the same genre. And the final thing that I want to say is that those games that I said, like the retro, the arcade, and the Nintendo games, would always prioritize the gameplay and the fluidity above everything else. Even sometimes maybe the audio could be better than the gameplay, but they would always try to have some kind of smooth gameplay in order to ensure that people would want to play the game. Because back then the games were complete, that is also a thing. Back then the games were feature complete and they didn't have too many revisions. Maybe some PC games had expansions, but not too much about the console games. And of course, mostly specifically for the Nintendo games, it was not only just prioritizing the gameplay, but also prioritizing fun. That was something that can get lost today, because when you have like A story experience usually will be very focused on that and not really about goofy things and stuff like this. Very specific games still has those kind of aspects. So yeah, those were my thoughts. Those are the reasons why I feel that I still prefer the retro, arcade, and current Nintendo games over pretty much everything else that exists out today. Please leave in the comments your opinions, and if you like this video, consider subscribing. Thank you for watching, see you next time.